Imagine for a second that you are living in a society where basically your entire life is dictated by an invisible ledger.
Right, like every single interaction you have is a transaction.
Exactly. I mean, if someone powerful does you a favor, you owe them your absolute loyalty, your public praise, maybe even your life.
Yeah, the stakes were incredibly high.
But then imagine finding a document that completely upends that social order. A text that says, the ultimate power in the universe gives away wealth, healing, and status for free,
Right.
without demanding a single favor in return.
Which, in the ancient world, a document like that wouldn't just be considered a new religion. It would be considered, well, dangerous.
Highly dangerous, yeah.
It would be revolutionary in the most literal sense of the word. I mean, it fundamentally attacks the economic and social foundations of how human beings have structured power since the dawn of civilization.
And today, we are going to look at 4 of those exact documents. We are doing a deep dive into the foundational texts of the New Testament, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It's a massive topic.
It is. But our mission for this deep dive is to bypass all the overwhelming, dense academic jargon and shortcut you to a really rich, well-informed understanding of these texts.
We really want to get to the core of it.
Right. And we've got a fantastic stack of notes and research today. We're drawing primarily on Chris Arvelasis's survey of the 4 Gospels, but we've also got some incredible archaeological reports and insights from places like the Smithsonian and Bible Odyssey to really ground this.
It's a great collection of material because we aren't just looking at theology floating in the clouds, We are looking at the actual dirt, the stones, and the politics of the first century Mediterranean world.
Exactly. And the ultimate goal for you, the listener, is to explore these 4 books, not as dry, flat histories, but as ancient, custom-tailored theological biographies. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Before we even get into who wrote what or the wild story of how they were compiled, we need to set the baseline. If you open up Bible today, these 4 books sit right at the head of the New Testament. Why there?
Yeah, that placement is incredibly deliberate, actually. To understand the Gospels, you have to understand their canonical context, where they sit in the grand library of Scripture.
Because they don't just exist in a vacuum.
Right, exactly. The entire Old Testament is a sprawling, multi-century narrative that frankly ends on a cliffhanger. It is filled with promises that are just left hanging in the air.
It's a story demanding an ending.
Precisely. I mean, you have the promise made to Abraham in the book of Genesis that through his family, all the nations of the earth would be blessed.
Right.
You have the law given through Moses, which established a covenant, but also showed how utterly incapable humanity was of keeping it.
Yeah, a lot of failure there.
So much failure. And you have the promise to King David that someone from his royal line would sit on the throne forever. And then, you have the later prophets who are watching their nation get conquered and exiled, crying out for a new creation, a new covenant, and the arrival of a Messiah who will fix a broken world.
So for hundreds of years, the audience is just waiting. The tension is building.
Right. And then you turn the page from Malachi to Matthew, and the Gospels announce the climactic event. They are declaring that the wait is over.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the inauguration of the new covenant has happened. So, in redemptive historical terms, the Gospels aren't just tacking a new character named Jesus onto the end of Israel's story.
Like a sequel nobody asked for.
Exactly. No, they are presenting him as the lens through which the entire Old Testament finally makes sense. Every narrative thread, every prophetic hope converges in this one person.
It's the big crescendo.
Yeah.
But here is where modern readers, myself included, often get tripped up. When we try to read that culmination story, we apply our modern expectations to it. And our research makes a very sharp point about this. Current scholarship classifies the Gospels as ancient biographies.
Yes. And that adjective, ancient, is doing a massive amount of heavy lifting there.
Because when I hear the word biography, I immediately picture one of those massive 800-page doorstops you see at the bookstore.
Right, like a textbook.
Yeah, a modern biography is basically a chronological spreadsheet of a person's life.
Yeah.
The author tells you where they were born, what they ate for breakfast on a Tuesday in 1994, every letter they ever wrote, and they try to be completely detached.
It's objective reportage.
Right. But our notes clarify that these Gospels narrate a life for theological and ecclesial meaning church ends. They are not detached.
Not at all. If you go into the Gospels expecting a modern clinical X-ray of a history, you are going to be very confused, and frankly, you're going to miss the entire point.
But wait, let me push back here. If it's not detached reportage, does that mean they were just making things up?
Not at all.
Because if I'm listening to this and I hear that they had an agenda, my first thought is, okay, so this is ancient historical fiction. How do we know it's grounded in reality?
That is the crucial distinction to make. We have to separate historical fiction from what scholars call theological history. They absolutely were not making things up out of thin air. The events they are describing, the teachings, the conflicts, the crucifixion, these are rooted in the real dirt and dust of the first century. But an ancient biographer didn't care about giving you a day-by-day diary. Think of it less like a high-resolution photograph and more like a masterful portrait painting.
Oh, I like that. A portrait.
Right, a photographer captures every single stray hair and blemish without discrimination. But a portrait painter, they might use the lighting to highlight a specific feature of their subject's face.
Yeah, they make artistic choices.
Exactly. They might arrange the posture to convey the person's authority or their sorrow. They are painting the real person, but they are organizing and emphasizing the reality to reveal the subject's true essence.
So the gospel writers are the portrait painters. They took the actual historical events of Jesus' life, but they arranged them to highlight specific truths, like showing how he fulfills that Abrahamic blessing or how he is the true King David.
Exactly. They are writing history, but it is history with a verdict attached. They aren't just saying, here's some information for your trivia night. They are presenting the historical reality of Jesus and asking the reader, now what are you going to do about it?
Which means, if we really want to understand the portrait they painted, we have to understand the canvas they were painting on. If these texts are grounded in history, we need to get our hands dirty. We need to understand the actual stones, the dirt, and the politics of that world.
Because you can't understand the radical nature of their agenda if you don't know what they were pushing against.
Exactly. And the physical world they were pushing against was Roman Judea and Galilee in what historians call the late Second Temple period. Let's pause and define that, because Second Temple period is one of those academic terms that gets thrown around a lot. What exactly does that mean for the average person living back then?
So the first temple was built by King Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians centuries earlier. The second temple was built after the Jewish people returned from exile, and it was later massively expanded by Herod the Great.
Around 37 to 4 BCE.
Yes. And for a first century Jewish person, this temple in Jerusalem wasn't just a big church, it was the center of the universe.
The absolute center.
It was the national bank, the political capital, the slaughterhouse for daily sacrifices, and the literal footstool of God on earth. The entire culture was a pressure cooker structured around this temple, the Torah, strict purity laws, and the Sabbath.
And sitting right on top of that religious pressure cooker is the crushing weight of the Roman Empire.
Precisely. You have the Jewish national identity trying to survive under the boot of Roman imperialism. You have client kings like Herod the Great, a brilliant builder, but a paranoid, brutal tyrant.
He was terrifying.
Completely.
Yeah.
And then you have his sons dividing up the territory, like Herod Antipas up in Galilee. And when direct Roman rule was required, you had Roman prefects.
Which brings us to Pontius Pilate. Pilate governed Judea from 26 to 36 CE. He is infamous as the man who sentenced Jesus to death. But for a long time, Pilate was actually a problem for historians, wasn't he?
He was. For centuries, skeptics looked at the Gospels and pointed out that outside of these religious texts and a couple of brief mentions by ancient historians, we had no hard physical Roman evidence of a Pontius Pilate holding the title of prefect in Judea.
So it looks suspicious.
It made people wonder if the Gospel writers had just invented him as a convenient Roman villain.
Until the archaeologists started digging.
Yes. Our research highlights an incredible discovery, the Pilate inscription. In 1961, an Italian team was excavating an ancient Roman theater in Caesarea Maritima, this lavish port city built by Herod on the Mediterranean coast.
Right on the water?
Yeah. They found a piece of limestone that had literally been reused as a step in a staircase. But on it, carved in stone, was a Latin inscription dedicating a building to the Emperor Tiberius. And right there, clear as day, was the name Pontius Pilatus and his title, Prefect of Judea.
Imagine being the person dusting off that step. I mean, in an instant, this major biblical figure is pulled out of the realm of myth and anchored into cold, hard, verifiable Roman administration.
It's mind-blowing.
It perfectly validates the historical stage the Gospels are set on.
And that's just one piece of the puzzle. If we move north from Judea up to Galilee, where Jesus spent the vast majority of his ministry, the archaeology continues to vividly confirm the text. Take the town of Capernaum.
Capernaum is basically Jesus's home base, right? His second home.
It was. And when archaeologists excavated it, they found exactly what the Gospels describe. The texts constantly showed Jesus interacting with tax collectors, Roman centurions, and merchants.
Because it wasn't just a sleepy little village.
No, the ruins of Capernaum show it was a major Galilean settlement. It sat right on a major international trade route. It had a Roman garrison, a customs station, and a bustling market. The physical layout of the town perfectly matches the economic and social dynamics we read about in the narrative.
And we see that same kind of validation with the Magdala stone. In the town of Magdala, they unearthed the first century synagogue, and inside was this intricately carved stone block showing the menorah and elements of the Jerusalem temple.
Yes, the Smithsonian research points out that this vividly illuminates what synagogue Judaism looked like in Jesus' day.
It proves that the intense scriptural Jewish matrix that Jesus is teaching in was absolutely real.
We even have insight into the people who opposed him. We found what is highly probable to be the Caiaphas ossuary.
Okay, let's explain an ossuary because it's a bit grim but fascinating.
It is a bit macabre, yeah. In elite first century Jerusalem, when someone died, they were placed in a tomb until their flesh decayed.
Just laid out on a stone bench.
Right. After about a year, the family would return, gather the bones, and place them into a carved limestone box called an ossuary. It's a secondary burial practice. In 1990, workers building a water park in Jerusalem accidentally broke into a first-century burial cave.
Talk about a bizarre day at work.
Seriously. And inside was a beautifully ornate ossuary inscribed with the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas.
And Caiaphas is the high priest who presided over Jesus' religious trial. So we are potentially looking at the literal bones of the man who handed Jesus over to Pilate.
It is incredibly likely. It gives us a direct window into the elite Jerusalem establishment of that exact era.
Okay, but let me push back on one of the artifacts our sources highlight, because I know you have a great perspective on this. The Smithsonian notes bring up the Jesus boat.
Ah, yes.
This was a huge discovery in 1986. There was a severe drought, the Sea of Galilee receded, and two brothers found the remains of a first-century fishing vessel buried in the mud. Now, the notes are extremely clear. Archaeology absolutely cannot identify this as the boat of Jesus. We can't prove Jesus or Peter or any of the disciples ever stepped foot in it. It's just a 2,000-year-old boat. So why does it matter? Why do historians and biblical scholars care so much about a random boat?
What's fascinating here is that the value of the artifact doesn't depend on proving a specific miracle or a specific moment in the text. You're right, we will never know the names of the men who sailed that exact vessel, but what it does is definitively anchor the narratives in a verifiable, concrete world.
How so?
Think about the Synoptic Gospels. They spend so much time talking about these men who were lake fishermen. They talk about their nets, the size of their crews, and the sudden violent storms on the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, water is a huge theme.
Right. When archaeologists examined the Jesus boat, they found it was made of 10 different types of wood, patched together over years of hard use.
Meaning they were poor.
It tells us exactly about the poverty and the economic reality of the lake fishermen. They couldn't afford a new boat, so they just kept patching this one. And it was big enough to hold about 13 men, which perfectly fits the narrative of Jesus and his 12 disciples being in a boat together.
Wow. So it makes the text three-dimensional.
Exactly. It vividly illuminates the nautical technology and the harsh physical environment of Capernaum and the shore villages. It proves the gospel writers intimately, deeply knew the world they were writing about. They didn't just invent a maritime culture out of thin air, they lived in it.
So it's not about finding the exact piece of wood Jesus touched. It's about validating the entire stage set.
Right.
Which makes total sense. Now, rediscovering the physical world, the boats, the stones, the burial boxes, it naturally begs the question about the invisible world.
The culture.
Right. How did the people living in those towns actually treat each other? What were the social rules?
And this is where modern readers really have to do some mental gymnastics. The first century Mediterranean world operated on a completely different psychological and social operating system than we do today.
It's alien to us.
Totally alien. Our sources emphasize that this was a world driven by extended households, kinship networks, incredibly strict purity boundaries, and intense economic precarity.
But the two biggest engines driving everything, the invisible forces dictating every interaction, were honor and shame, and the patronage economy. Let's talk about honor and shame first. Because today, if someone shames you, it hurts your feelings, maybe you get canceled on social media. But in this culture, it was literally life and death.
Reputation was everything. It was your currency. And in the first century, honor was viewed as a limited resource. It was a zero-sum game.
Like a pie. If you get a slice, I have less pie.
Yes. If you gained honor, someone else had to lose it.
So if someone publicly challenged you in the marketplace and you couldn't defend yourself or outwit them,
Yeah.
you didn't just look foolish, you lost your actual honor and they took it from you.
Precisely. This is why the conflict scenes in the Gospels are so explosive. The religious leaders are constantly coming up to Jesus in public and asking him trick questions about taxes or the law.
They're trying to trap him.
They aren't genuinely curious. They are trying to publicly shame him and steal his honor.
And it extended to every part of life, especially who you ate with.
Table fellowship was the ultimate display of social standing. To share a meal with someone was to declare them your equal, to validate their honor and their purity.
If you're listening to this, think about a modern networking event or a high-stakes corporate dinner, but multiply the tension by 1,000. Imagine trying to navigate a world where a simple dinner invitation could literally ruin your social standing.
It was exhausting.
If you sat at the wrong table with someone deemed a sinner or impure, you were marked as impure by association. You lost your honor.
Which makes Jesus' actions in the Gospels so utterly scandalous. You have scenes where he is eating with tax collectors who are considered corrupt traitors, or allowing a woman with a terrible reputation to wash his feet with her tears at a formal dinner party.
He is constantly subverting the system. He honors the lowly, the people society is deemed shameful, and he shames the proud, the people who hoard the honor. He's totally inverting the social pyramid.
And he does the same thing with the patronage system, which was the other massive engine of the ancient world.
I read this part of the notes on patronage, and my brain immediately went to a mob movie.
A mob movie.
Yeah. Think about The Godfather. You go to the Don on the day of his daughter's wedding and ask for a favor.
Yeah.
He grants it, but he says, someday, and that day may never come, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Okay, I see where you're going.
It is the ultimate, I scratch your back, you owe me your life setup. In the ancient world, society ran on these patron-client relationships. A wealthy patron provides protection, or land, or money to a peasant client. But in return, the client is forever in their debt.
Right, they owe the patron unwavering loyalty, public praise, and whatever favors the patron demands.
It's a very apt analogy. The entire social fabric was woven out of a reciprocal obligation. The sources point out that tax collectors, centurions, and wealthy elites were all part of this patronage landscape. You survive by finding a good patron and being a good client, but then you read the Gospels, and they take this deeply ingrained patron-client expectation and they just shatter it. They present God as the ultimate patron, the true benefactor of humanity. But here is the massive twist God gives without reciprocal obligation.
He doesn't demand you pay him back in favors because you literally can't.
The grace is free.
Exactly. Our sources cite a brilliant moment in Luke's gospel where Jesus is at a banquet and he turns to the host and says, when you throw a party, don't invite your rich friends who can invite you back and repay you.
Right.
He says, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind people who literally have zero capacity to ever return the favor.
Which is insane in that culture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see why the authorities wanted to execute him. He wasn't just introducing a new philosophical idea. He was tearing up the economic and social foundations of the Roman and Jewish world.
Right, he was redefining what it meant to owe someone, what it meant to be great, and what it meant to be clean. It was a complete paradigm shift.
It really was.
So, having set this incredible, volatile historical and cultural stage, we have to look at the texts themselves. How did the 4 specific authors actually document this radical life? This brings us to one of the most famous puzzles in history. When you open the New Testament, you immediately notice something strange about the first 3 books.
Yes, the synoptic puzzle.
Let's define that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. That comes from a Greek root meaning seen together. Because if you lay these 3 books side by side, they share a massive amount of overlap.
Almost identical in places.
Yeah, we aren't just talking about telling the same general stories. We are talking about identical structure, sequence, and verbatim Greek wording.
It is entirely obvious to any scholar that they are literarily interdependent. Somebody was copying somebody. John is off doing his own unique thing, which we will get to later. But regarding Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the question has always been, who wrote first? And who copied whom?
And how do scholars figure that out?
The dominant, nearly universal scholarly view today is called Markan priority. This means Mark was written first, generally dated around 65 to 70 CE. Matthew and Luke came later, and they both independently used Mark as their foundational source text.
But how do they know Mark didn't copy Matthew? Why is Mark the starting line?
There are a few fascinating clues. For one, Mark is the shortest. Usually when ancient authors copied a text, they expanded on it to add their own theology. They didn't drastically condense it.
Makes sense.
But more tellingly, it's the grammar. Mark's Greek is, quite frankly, a bit rough. It's colloquial, sometimes awkward. When you look at the exact same stories in Matthew or Luke, you can actually see them cleaning up Mark's grammar. They are polishing the rough draft.
That is so cool. So if you want a visual of this, imagine a desk. On that desk is a copy of Mark. Matthew comes along, reads Mark, fixes the grammar, adds some new material, and writes his gospel.
Exactly.
Later, Luke comes along, reads Mark, fixes the grammar, adds his own new material, and writes his gospel.
Yeah.
Mark is the fountainhead.
That's a great way to picture it. Our notes from Britannica confirm that both Matthew and Luke incorporate the vast majority of Mark's gospel directly into their own texts.
Okay, but here is my big question. If Matthew and Luke both copied from Mark, what about the stuff they share that isn't Mark?
Ah, right.
Because there are famous stories and sayings like the Lord's Prayer or the Beatitudes that are almost identical in Matthew and Luke, but Mark never mentions them once.
Yeah.
If they didn't get them from Mark and they didn't copy each other, where did they get them?
That is the multi-million-dollar question, and it requires a bit of literary math to solve. To explain this shared non-Markan material, scholars introduce the Q hypothesis.
What is Q?
Q comes from the German word Quell, which simply means source. It is a hypothetical lost document. We have never found a physical copy of it.
But we assume it was there.
Mathematically, scholars infer it must have existed. It would have been mostly a collection of Jesus' sayings and teachings. So let's go back to your desk analogy. When Matthew sat down to write, he didn't just have Mark on his desk. He had Mark on his left and he had Q on his right.
Oh, I see.
And he wove both of those documents together, along with his own unique traditions. Luke did the exact same thing independently.
So it's like this massive ancient group project, but they're all editing, compiling, and arranging the sources to make their own distinct theological points.
Exactly. And you can see their distinct theological points in how they structure their books. The literary architecture is brilliant. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the entire narrative hinges on one specific pivot point.
The confession.
Yes. Everything builds up to the moment where Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter confesses, "You are the Messiah."
And immediately after that, the tone shifts.
Dramatically. Immediately after that confession, Jesus predicts his death for the first time, and the entire rest of the narrative is a long, dark journey toward the cross in Jerusalem. That is the structural hinge of the Synoptics.
The John structure is totally different.
Completely apart. John doesn't use that confession as his pivot. John's gospel pivots around the raising of Lazarus from the dead.
Right.
That miracle is the catalyst that forces the religious leaders to plot Jesus' death, and it transitions the book into what Jesus calls his hour, the passion and crucifixion.
So we have four incredibly deliberate, distinct architectures, which is the perfect segue to actually meet the witnesses. Let's look at each of these unique voices one by one, starting with the earliest and its most famous adapter. Let's start with Mark.
According to early church tradition and reflected in our sources, Mark is linked to John Mark, who is an early Christian acting as an interpreter for the Apostle Peter.
So it's Peter's memories.
The tradition sees Peter's raw eyewitness testimony standing behind this text. As we mentioned, it's dated around 65 to 70 CE.
And the vibe of Mark. If you read it in one sitting, it is breathless. The notes describe it as concise, urgent, action-driven. He uses the Greek word for immediately, constantly. It's like Jesus went here and immediately a demon showed up and immediately he healed someone and immediately the Pharisees attacked him.
Mark does not waste time with long speeches or backstory. He drops you right into the action. And his main theological idea is that Jesus is the suffering Son of God. Mark is deeply concerned with presenting a paradox. The messiahship of Jesus is revealed not through military conquest, not through sitting on a golden throne, but through the horror of the cross.
And this ties into a massive theme in Mark called the messianic secret, right?
Yes. Throughout the first half of the book, whenever Jesus performs a miracle or a demon recognizes who he is, Jesus strictly commands them to keep quiet.
He doesn't want the hype.
He doesn't want the title of Messiah yet because the crowds misunderstand it. They want a military conqueror to overthrow the Romans. Mark is insisting that you cannot understand who Jesus is until you see him hanging on a Roman cross. The path to glory runs straight through suffering.
And Mark actually pushes that tension all the way to the very last sentence of his book. There's a famous textual issue with the ending of Mark.
It is one of the most debated issues in textual criticism.
Because it just stops.
It really does. If you look at the earliest and most reliable Greek manuscripts we have of Mark, the gospel ends very abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8. The women go to the tomb on Sunday morning. They find it empty. A young man in a white robe tells them Jesus has risen. And then the text says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's it. End of book.
Wait, slow down. You're telling me the earliest gospel just ends mid-sentence,
Yeah.
basically, without anyone actually seeing the resurrected Jesus,
Yeah.
just fear and silence. How did early readers not lose their minds over that cliffhanger?
Well, many scholars believe they did, which is why verses 9 through 20, which contain actual resurrection appearances and a much neater wrap-up, were likely added later by scribes to smooth out that jarring ending.
Okay, that makes sense.
Many scholars judge that longer ending to be secondary. But here's what's fascinating. Why would Mark intentionally end it so abruptly?
Because it forces the reader to answer the question.
Exactly. The entire book is demanding a verdict. By leaving the women terrified and silent, Mark turns to the reader and implicitly asks, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to run away in fear, or are you going to take up your cross and follow him? It's a literary masterpiece of unresolved tension.
I love that. Okay, so if Mark is this breathless, urgent, unresolved tension, let's look at Matthew. Because Matthew takes Mark's urgent framework and builds a massive cathedral out of it.
That is the perfect way to describe it. Matthew is formally anonymous in the text itself, though traditionally attributed to Matthew the tax collector. It's usually dated a bit later, in the AD CE, and its audience is widely understood to be a deeply Jewish Christian community.
And if Mark is just action, 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 Matthew is incredibly deliberate and structured. He builds his gospel around 5 massive discourse blocks. The Sermon on the Mount is the most famous of these.
The structure is highly intentional. By organizing Jesus' teachings into 5 major blocks, Matthew is deliberately echoing the 5 books of Moses, the Torah.
So he's framing Jesus as a new Moses.
Exactly, presenting Jesus as the new Moses. But Matthew's overarching idea is fulfillment. He uses this specific formula constantly. This happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet.
He is relentlessly connecting the dots back to the Old Testament. He wants to prove Jesus is the Davidic Messiah, bringing the law to its ultimate intended goal.
Right. He is meticulously demonstrating to his Jewish audience that Jesus isn't canceling their ancient traditions or their scriptures. He is the magnificent completion of them.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. If we think about movies, Mark is like an intense handheld camera documentary trailer. It's right in your face, shaky, fast-paced, cutting quickly from one conflict to the next, emphasizing the suffering. But Matthew is like a carefully curated, sweeping, cinematic, historical epic.
Oh, definitely.
It opens with this massive, majestic genealogy proving royal lineage. And it features these grand, sweeping speeches on mountainsides showing a new king taking his throne.
That captures the literary difference perfectly, and it impacts what they expect from the reader. Mark is pressing the reader toward what scholars call cruciform discipleship.
Meaning cross-shaped discipleship.
Yes, Mark's logic is brutal but simple. If the leader suffers, the followers must suffer too. To follow Jesus means taking up a cross. Matthew shares that, of course, but Matthew places a heavier emphasis on obedience to the teachings of the new king.
Right, yeah.
He focuses on righteousness, ethics, and living out the Sermon on the Mount in a community.
So from the urgent trailer and the majestic epic, let's transition to the final 2 witnesses. From the historian and the poet. Let's look at Luke.
Luke is fascinating. Like Matthew, the book is formally anonymous, but very early tradition attributes it to a man named Luke, a beloved physician and a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. It's generally dated somewhere between 63 and 90 CE.
And Luke's vibe is completely different. The notes call it historiographically self-conscious, which means he knows he's writing history.
Yes, he literally starts his book with a prologue that sounds like a classical Greek historian. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account."
It's very formal.
It's highly educated, elegant Greek.
And he structures it uniquely, too. A massive chunk of Luke's gospel, almost 10 chapters, is just a long, slow travel narrative of Jesus journeying from Galilee toward Jerusalem. And uniquely, Luke's gospel doesn't end the story. It flows directly into a sequel.
The Book of Acts. Together, Luke and Acts form a massive 2-volume work on the origins of Christianity. Volume 1 is the life of Jesus, and Volume 2 is the spirit-empowered witness of the early church spreading that message across the Roman Empire.
And Luke has some incredibly specific themes. Our sources highlight his focus on salvation history. What does that mean in this context?
Salvation history is the idea that God has a grand, unfolding timeline for saving humanity. Luke sees it in distinct phases: the era of Israel and the prophets, the central era of Jesus' earthly ministry, and then the era of the church and the Holy Spirit extending salvation to the whole world.
And who did that salvation go to in Luke, Janner? That's what really stands out to me. Luke is intensely focused on the marginalized. If Matthew is focused on kings and fulfillment, Luke is focused on the outsiders.
Absolutely.
He highlights Gentiles, the poor, Samaritans, women, and outcasts. He is also the gospel that most heavily emphasizes prayer and meals. So many of Jesus' major teachings in Luke happen while he's sitting at a dinner table.
Because, as we discussed earlier, the dinner table was the center of social boundary making. By showing Jesus constantly eating with the wrong people, Luke is highlighting the radical, worldwide, inclusive scope of this new kingdom. The message goes from the dusty roads of Galilee to the capital in Jerusalem, and then, in the book of Acts, out to the nations and eventually to Rome itself.
Which brings us finally to John, the fourth gospel. And John is a completely different universe.
Traditionally linked to the Apostle John, or perhaps a Johannine circle of his followers who compiled his testimony. It's almost universally dated late, around 90 to 100 CE, and likely written in the city of Ephesus.
If the synoptics are down in the dirt, John's vibe is soaring in the heavens. It is highly symbolic, philosophical, and reflective. It's famously organized into two main halves. The first half is the Book of Signs, and the second half is the Book of Glory.
John's main idea is profoundly theological. While the synoptics start with genealogies for John the Baptist, John starts before time began. He presents Jesus as the eternal Word, the Logos made flesh, and John is overtly evangelistic.
He lays his cards on the table.
He doesn't leave you guessing. He literally tells the reader his purpose at the very end of the book. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
John is also where we get those famous, profound I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd.
By using I am, Jesus is deliberately echoing the sacred divine name of God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. John's Christology, his understanding of who Jesus is incredibly exalted.
Okay, but I have to stop and push back here. Because if someone is reading these four books side by side, they are going to hit a wall when they get to John. Our sources acknowledge this freely. John's chronology and his geography are totally different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yeah, it's very noticeable.
In the synoptics, Jesus essentially ministers in Galilee for a year or so, and then takes one fateful trip to Jerusalem where he dies. But in John, Jesus travels back and forth to Jerusalem for multiple different festivals over the course of 3 years. Even the timeline of the Last Supper and the crucifixion is slightly different. So as a reader, how do I process this? Does this mean someone is lying? Did someone get their facts wrong?
This is a fantastic question, and it brings us right back to what we established in the very beginning about the genre of ancient biography. We have to remember that John is offering an overtly theological testimony.
Right.
He is painting a portrait, not filling out a police report. In John, the miracles aren't just displays of power. He explicitly calls them signs.
Yep.
They are revelatory acts that disclose Jesus' divine identity.
So the timeline isn't an error, it's an arrangement.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, John has arranged his material and, yes, adapted the chronology to make his theological points as clear and powerful as possible. For instance, in John, Jesus dies at the exact moment the Passover lambs are being slaughtered in the temple. Oh, wow.
John arranges the timeline to highlight the theological truth that Jesus is the ultimate Passover lamb. For an ancient reader, this wasn't seen as deceptive. It was seen as brilliant, profound storytelling that revealed the deeper truth of the historical events.
Acknowledging those differences naturally leads us into how we handle the complexities of these texts today. Because when you have 4 distinct witnesses, you are going to have knots to untangle. How do scholars deal with this, and how should a listener process these variations?
Our sources suggest a really helpful framework for this. They divide the interpretive issues into 3 buckets: essential, secondary, and speculative.
Let's unpack the essential bucket first.
The essential bucket contains the core historical and theological claims that are completely unified across all 4 texts. This includes the reality of Jesus' earthly ministry, his teachings on the kingdom, his real death on a Roman cross under Pontius Pilate, and his bodily resurrection.
The bedrock stuff.
If you remove these, the texts collapse. They're non-negotiable for what the texts are claiming.
Okay, then you have the secondary bucket. These are the chronological or structural differences we've been talking about. For example, the chronology of Jesus cleansing the temple. In the Synoptics, it happens at the very end of his ministry and gets him killed. In John, it happens in chapter 2 at the very beginning of his ministry.
Right.
Also in this bucket are the slight variations in the infancy narratives between Matthew and Luke. These differences matter for deep study, but they don't overturn the core claims of the essential bucket.
And finally, the speculative bucket.
This is the realm of high-level academic debate. This includes the exact word-for-word reconstructions of that hypothetical Q source, or debates over the different compositional layers and editors of John's Gospel, or the exact original ending of Mark.
If you are listening to this right now, I want to emphasize how incredibly freeing this three-bucket framework is. People often read the Bible and panic if they find a chronological difference. They think, wait, Matthew says one blind man, Mark says two, the whole thing must be a lie.
Yeah, that's a common reaction.
But if you understand the genre of ancient biography, you don't have to panic over a detail like exactly when the temple was cleansed, because the core, essential claims remain a rock-solid, unified front across all four witnesses.
And this raises a vital point about historical credibility. I always encourage critical thinking when looking at ancient texts. The presence of multiple perspectives, different theological emphases, and slight chronological variations actually gives this collection more historical credibility, not less.
Because if they were four perfectly colluded, identical copies, we'd know it was a scam.
Exactly. Imagine you are a judge in a courtroom, and four witnesses take the stand to describe a car crash. If all four of them use the exact same words, describe the exact same timeline down to the second, and emphasize the exact same details, what does the judge know?
The judge knows they met in the hallway beforehand and colluded to get their story straight.
Yep.
It's a forgery.
Right. But if one witness focuses on the sound of the crash, another focuses on the color of the car, and another remembers the sequence of events slightly differently based on where they were standing, that is the hallmark of authentic, independent human memory.
That makes perfect sense.
The variations show we have four distinct, authentic voices drawing on a real, historical, world-changing event.
To truly understand the depth of those authentic voices, we have to look at the exact words they used. And I mean the literal, original language. The New Testament was written in Greek, but it documents a world that primarily spoke Aramaic. The specific words these writers chose carry massive cultural weight. Let's explore a few key terms from the research. First up is a huge one, euangelion.
Euangelion is a Greek word that we translate in English as gospel or good news. It is programmatic for the whole collection. Mark literally starts his book by saying the beginning of the Evangelion about Jesus. But what we often miss is that in the ancient Roman world, Evangelion was heavily used as a piece of imperial political propaganda. When a new Roman emperor took the throne, or when a Roman general won a massive military victory and brought peace to a region, heralds would be sent out to announce the Evangelion, the good news of the emperor.
Oh, wow.
So by hijacking that specific word and applying it to a crucified Jewish carpenter, the gospel writers are making an insanely subversive claim about who is truly in charge of the world. They are saying Caesar isn't the good news, Jesus is.
Wow. Next term from the notes is Christos.
Christos is simply the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach, or Messiah. It literally means anointed one. It carries a deeply royal and redemptive identity tied directly back to those Old Testament promises of a coming Davidic king who would rescue Israel.
And then there's a phrase that Jesus used to describe himself constantly. He rarely called himself the Messiah, but he constantly called himself Hous tu anthropou, or Son of Man.
This is a brilliant, layered title.
Yeah.
On the surface, Son of Man just means a human being. But any first-century Jewish person would recognize it as a direct reference to the Old Testament book of Daniel.
Chapter 7, right?
Yes. In Daniel chapter 7, there is a vision of a cosmic, authoritative figure, one like a son of man, who comes on the clouds of heaven and is given an eternal kingdom and authority over all nations by God.
So it's a claim to massive cosmic power.
It is. But here is the genius of Jesus' usage in the Gospels. He takes that title of supreme Danielic authority, and he fuses it with the concept of intense suffering. He tells his disciples, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be killed.
Which would have sounded crazy to them.
Exactly. That juxtaposition, supreme cosmic authority achieved through suffering and death, was a shocking, completely paradigm-breaking concept for a first-century listener.
It totally redefines power. Another massive term is logos, which John uses in his famous soaring opening. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Logos means word, reason, or message. But John is playing 3D chess here. In Greek philosophy, the logos was the animating, rational principle of the universe. It was the divine logic holding reality together.
And in Jewish thought.
In Jewish thought, the Word of God was the active, creative force that spoke the universe into existence in Genesis. John brilliantly grabs a term that resonates deeply with both Greek and Jewish cultures and uses it to describe the incarnation, saying that this cosmic principle, this creative word, just became a human being with flesh and blood.
Our sources also highlight a couple of vivid Aramaic phrases. The Gospel writers wrote in Greek, but occasionally they perfectly preserve the actual original Aramaic sounds that came out of Jesus' mouth. One of them is Abba.
Abba is an Aramaic term for father. Jesus uses it in Mark 14 during his agonizing prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he dies.
It's a very intimate word, isn't it?
Very. In ancient religion, you approach deities with extreme formality, terror, and distance. Abba denotes an incredibly intimate familial relationship. It's the language of a child speaking to a loving parent. It shatters the formal distance expected in religion.
And the other one is Talita Kum.
Which means, little girl, arise. It's from a beautiful scene where Jesus raises a synagogue leader's young daughter from the dead. Mark preserves the exact Aramaic syllables Jesus whispered to the child. It's such a tender, vivid eyewitness detail, you can almost hear his voice in the room.
These language details really bridge the gap between the ancient theology and our reality today. Which brings us to the contemporary relevance of these texts. The sources note that these 4 books are deeply anti-triumphalist. They insist, over and over, that true glory comes through suffering and service, not military conquest or dominating your enemies.
They're also profoundly anti-individualist. In our modern Western world, we view salvation or spirituality as a private, me and God transaction. The Gospels insist that salvation forms a people, a community. You can't live the Sermon on the Mount alone on an island.
And they are anti-tribalist, because the Messianic mission explicitly breaks down ethnic barriers and includes the nations, the outsiders, and the enemies.
They relentlessly confront our modern idolatries.
And I want to take a moment to be very clear and totally objective here, directly reflecting our source material. The texts of the Gospels themselves heavily emphasize the concept of justice. The sources make it clear that in these narratives, Jesus deliberately identifies with the poor, the sick, and the marginalized.
Yes, very explicitly.
Furthermore, the texts show Jesus harshly judging hypocrisy and any religious performance that is detached from mercy and care for the vulnerable. Now, it's fascinating because today, people try to map these texts onto modern political spectrums, trying to make Jesus left-wing or right-wing. But if we look strictly at what the original text itself says, it doesn't fit neatly into our 21st century political boxes.
It really doesn't.
We aren't using this to endorse any modern political platform. We're simply looking at the explicit, unavoidable, theological, and social claims contained within the original Greek documents. The text is making a claim about justice that completely ignores our modern political dividing lines.
It's unavoidable in the narrative. They redefine leadership entirely. The parables and teachings constantly reiterate that the greatest among you must become a servant.
Right.
In the Roman world, authority meant the power to lord over others and bend them to your will. In the Gospels, authority is defined as taking on sacrificial responsibility for the good of others.
So what does this all mean? If you are listening to this right now, whether you are deeply religious, whether you are just studying for a history exam, or you are just insanely curious about how ancient literature shaped the modern world, how should you process these 4 books today?
It means you are engaging with texts that fundamentally challenge how the world operates. They present a worldview where power is found in servanthood, where the marginalized are brought to the center of the story, and most profoundly, where death is not the final word.
Which changes everything.
The claim of the resurrection changes the entire horizon of human life. You don't have to agree with it, you don't have to believe it, but you have to recognize that it is a massively paradigm-shifting narrative. It demands a response.
It really does. Let's do a quick recap of the incredible journey we've been on today. We started by looking at the dusty, physical reality of Galilean archaeology, the Pilate inscription, the first-century synagogues, and that patched-together fishing boat that anchors this story in real, verifiable dirt.
It sets the stage perfectly.
Then we unpacked the intense pressure cooker cultural matrix of honor, shame, and the rigid patronage economy. We untangled the synoptic puzzle, visualizing how Mark sat on the desk and fed into Matthew and Luke.
And we met the authors.
Yeah, we listened to the four distinct, unique voices of the gospel writers. Mark's breathless urgency, Matthew's majestic Old Testament fulfillment, Luke's historical inclusion of the outcast, and John's soaring cosmic theology. Four distinct, independent witnesses offering one massive, unified narrative.
They are four historically grounded literary masterpieces that continue to provoke and challenge whoever dares to read them closely.
And that brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. Something for you to mull over after you turn this off. Think back to what we discussed about the patronage system. These ancient texts fundamentally subverted the rigid expectations of their day by presenting a God who gives without demanding reciprocal obligation.
A radical idea.
A God who gives grace without keeping a ledger, requiring you to pay him back in favors. So think about this. How might internalizing that radical, non-transactional worldview alter the way you approach your own life? What would happen to your relationships, your career networking, and your own internal power dynamics today if you completely stopped keeping a ledger of who owes you what?
That is a deeply challenging question, and it gets right to the heart of what makes these ancient biographies so enduringly provocative.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the four Gospels. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.